Journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Good evening. A major speech today by Michael Gove on housing. No mention of migration and rising numbers of people, and the appearance that all housing targets have now been scrapped. Dentistry is back in the news, as over 80% of the population cannot get an NHS dentist. Is this potentially good news for the Labour Party? And President Biden's loathing of the United Kingdom now means that any prospect of a trade deal under his presidency has now been sunk beneath the waves, along with his own approval rating, which is now down to 34%. All of that and much more over the course of the next hour. But first, let's get the news with Polly Middlehurst.
Nigel, thank you. Good evening. Well, the top story tonight, the Foreign Secretary says the UK will not tolerate attacks on shipping lanes in the Red Sea. Britain is joining an international maritime coalition dubbed Operation Security Guardian to protect ships in the area after a recent spate of attacks by Houthi militants in Yemen, allied with the Hamas terror group. The government says much of the UK's supply of liquefied natural gas is imported via these vital shipping routes, confirming that the Royal Navy destroyer HMS Diamond will be joining the new task force. Lord Cameron says the Royal Navy's presence will send a strong message to those who've been targeting commercial shipping.
There's a very clear message to the Houthis in Yemen who've been launching all these attacks that, these attacks will not be tolerated, and we will defend ourselves against them, and it's very important that shipping keeps moving.
Lord David Cameron. Well, here the Home Secretary says the government will not be able to rely on illegal immigration treaties with Rwanda if key elements of the agreement aren't in place. It comes as James Cleverly was unable to tell the Lords today what progress had been made on putting practical elements of the treaty into practice, including appointing international judges to sit in a new asylum appeals court. But Mr Cleverly defended the speed at which the government is seeking to get flights off the ground, saying he's determined to get this right. There's to be a new 45% tax ban for higher earners in Scotland. Deputy First Minister Shona Robertson set out her new package of measures to raise funds in her first Scottish budget. The new 45% ban will affect those earning between £75,000 and £125,000 a year and are predicted to raise around £1.5 billion for Scotland's finances next year. Victims who've been tricked into transferring money to fraudsters will be able to claim back up to £415,000 under new regulations. The payment systems regulator says the new measures, which are set to come into force in October next year, will prompt firms to do more to detect and prevent fraud from happening in the first place. The cost of reimbursing victims will be split 50-50 between sending and receiving payment firms, the government says. Now, a petition which could unseat the MP Peter Bone will close to voters in his Northamptonshire constituency later on this evening. The Wellingborough MP was suspended from the Commons for 6 weeks in October after an inquiry found he'd subjected a staff member to bullying and alleged sexual misconduct. He's sitting as an independent after losing the Conservative whip. If signed by 10% of his constituents, there will be a by-election. We'll keep you up to date on that throughout the evening. Right here on GB News, across the UK on TV, in your car, on digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. This is Britain's news channel.
Good evening. Housing goes up the list as one of the most important issues facing Britain today. The question of will your kids ever own a house is a very big and a very important one. I'd love some of your views on that, please. Farage@gbnews.com. So Michael Gove, who is Secretary of State for Levelling Up, for Housing. And by the way, since the Tories came to power, we've had 11 Secretaries for State in charge of housing and 16 ministers in charge of housing. Is it any wonder that we're in the mess that we are? But Gove's big mission today was to talk about house building. The government have a target of 300,000 new dwellings every year. And yet, for 2023, it's unlikely they'll build more than 160,000. So Gove gives this big speech where he says, we're going to build, we're going to develop, but we're not going to build on the Greenbelt. Well, fine. Actually, the concept of Greenbelt around our cities and towns to stop urban sprawl is something that I very much agree with. But as to the big message, it's totally confusing because I heard no repeat of the target of 300,000 a year. It felt to me that had been dropped. And then he says, whilst we want local government under local democracy to make decisions, we can and we will, after 3 months, override local government, leaving me, I have to confess, somewhat confused as to whether anything has really changed at all. But here is the most significant part of his speech. It's what he didn't say. Michael Gove, in reference to housing, made no comment whatsoever on our net migration last year rising by 745,000. We need to build a new dwelling in our country every 3 minutes, one dwelling every 3 minutes, just to cope with net migration numbers, let alone the shortage that we have already. And when it came to questions, of course it was GB News' Chris Hope that raised the rising population. And Gove did say that a rising population had an impact. No, it is, Mr. Gove, not an impact. It is the single biggest issue. And I felt today with Gove's speech that actually he showed himself and the government to be more out of touch with the rest of the country, to be more out of touch with reality than they've been at any point in time. When it comes to housing, they're a complete waste of space. And I'm sorry if that sounds like a harsh opinion, but I really, really mean it. Tell me, will your kids ever be able to have a house? Farage@gbnews.com. I'm joined by Mark Homer, co-founder, director of Progressive Property. Mark, you're somebody with a large number of rental properties in Peterborough and around that area. I mean, you must be delighted because the fewer houses we build, the bigger your rental income.
Well, there certainly is a huge shortage, and rents have probably gone up about 40% just since 2016, since the Brexit vote. Yeah. And that's at the core, that is because of a lack of supply of housing. The planning system, obviously, there have been some attacks on landlords, but this today is, the new national planning policy framework. And what they should be doing is unveiling, new ideas, ways in which we're going to be able to get to the 300,000. But what I think it actually is the removal of mandatory targets that the councils had to meet to, in terms of housing supply.
So the 300,000 figure appears to have gone.
Well, that's news to me. I mean, I didn't hear him say it. But, yeah, I mean, this is right back to David Cameron. 2010, they've had this 300,000 there. But, no, looking at this, I can't see how they're going to do that.
But don't we, Mark, and it's very interesting. When, I was having these debates and leaders' debates in 2015 with the other party leaders when I led UKIP in the general election. And they all talk about supply of housing, as you've talked about. But what about demand? If your population through immigration is going through the roof, your supply has to go up 2-3 times what it would without it. There was no acknowledgement from the Secretary of State on housing today of any of that.
Well, quite. I mean, Tony Blair, they had a target of 200,000.
Yeah.
David Cameron comes along, it goes to 300,000. What was net migration back in the Blair days? Well, I don't know, low sort of 200,000.
Well, I mean, even at its highest, it was less than half what it is now.
Yeah. So now we're over 700,000, average of 2 to 2.5 people per dwelling. So simple maths sort of tells you we've had all these years where they've not kept up, and now we're in a situation where the shortage is chronic.
So even if we reach 300,000, all that would do is deal with current net migration levels on the ratios you're talking about, and nothing to do with the backlog.
Absolutely not. Kate Barker wrote a report in 2003 looking at housing supply. There's been subsequent reports since then. We haven't kept pace since that report. And I think before that. You need more than 300,000 to deal with the backlog. And then...
Let alone...
Yeah, and then the new people on top of that.
Now, Gove talked about not building on Greenbelt. And this concept that we don't allow London or Birmingham just to grow exponentially, I rather agree with. The idea of a Greenbelt around the big cities. But we're going to need new towns here somewhere, aren't we?
Well, new towns are clearly the solution. They talk about brownfield sites continually, but there are only so many brownfield sites, upon which you can put this. But, there is a lot of land which we can develop in this country that isn't Greenbelt. But if you don't have properly funded, properly organised planning departments, and it's done at a local level with local decisions, then you're not going to be able to deliver.
So is planning the major problem in your view?
Planning is definitely the major problem. The planning system in this country is broken. It's dealt with at a local level. It's very political. If we had a sort of US system where it was zoned, and decisions were made based on, a clear set of rules, developers would be able to take risk, they would buy, and they would know that they would get planning consent as long as they built in that area to the specifications.
But this gets down to a democratic decision as well. We vote for local councils, we vote for district councils, county councils, unitary authorities. If central government overrules those, what price local democracy?
Well, that's what he's talking about doing. So he says, and if we're to believe him, Gove says that he's going to give them 3 months, and if they don't meet these advisory targets, he's going to take planning decisions off them at a local level and give it to the planning inspectorate, which is the Secretary of State. And somebody will get in a car a planning inspector will get in a car from a long way away, come to a local site and make a decision. That happens now on a refusal.
And then they'll be appealed against through the courts, through the legal processes, and even if the houses do get built, it'll take years.
It absolutely will. Judicial review will go on, and it won't speed things up. And, they're probably going to be gone by the halfway.
Well, this is very interesting, and I agree with this. Gove can say what he likes, but the odds are he won't be housing with us in a year's time. What have Labour got to say about this?
Well, Labour have got this target of 1.5 million houses
in 5 years.
Over 5 years.
So identical to the Tories.
Well, you divide 1.5 by 5 and you get 300,000 a year. So it just looks like more of the same. I haven't seen any new ideas from Starmer apart from we're going to build loads of social housing. But, where are the specifics? Where's it going to be built? Where's the money for it? What is the planning regime? Because that's critical, that's going to enable it. How are you going to incentivise local developers to get building this for the housing associations? None of this is there. It's all very generic.
It's a massive aspect of our national life. And the question that I'm asking the audience, will your kids ever have what you've had, the prospect of owning a house or buying a house or even getting on the ladder? We've got no nearer, have we?
I think we've got further away. I think it gets worse and worse every year. I just don't know how this gets fixed. Where is the impetus? Where is the sort of catalyst that changes this? And this just permeates through so many areas of government at the moment.
Mark Homer, Progressive Property, as ever, thank you for coming on and joining us here on GB News. And folks, this is another aspect, in my view, of broken Britain. A problem that appears to be insoluble. An opposition that offers almost nothing different for the government of the day, a problem that gets worse, rhetoric from government ministers who don't last for more than a year on average, and we get no closer to any sense of solution whatsoever. But for the Secretary of State for Housing to give a major housing intervention and at no point in his speech to mention the population explosion caused directly by government immigration policies shows you these people are totally and utterly detached from reality in the most remarkable way. In a moment, we'll talk dentists. We've said before on this programme, dentistry can't win you an election, but it could lose you an election as we learn that 80% of the population now have no prospect of an NHS dentist at all. All of that in just a moment.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox,
That's right, we want to hear from you,
GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Wake up to the headlines with headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show.
Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else.
We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride.
Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse.
It's news, but it's this close to entertainment.
Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So, post-Michael Gove's speech today, will your kids ever own a house? Vincent says, we are not alone as a country in having property prices out of reach for our children. The same crisis is also happening in America. Well, yes, that is partially true, but it depends what part of America you go to. Carol says, we live in Kent and are sick of hearing about building to meet housing targets. Of all the thousands of houses being built all around us, there are almost zero affordable housing amongst them. And Camilla says, in defence of Michael Gove, Gove is no fool, but he's been given an impossible job and he knows it. Well, Camilla, that may well be true, but we're no closer to solving any of this. And I repeat the point, he is the 11th Secretary of State in 13 years to oversee housing. And under that, there have been 16 housing ministers. How the hell can you run a country when people who take ministerial positions are there for a year or less? The whole thing is a nonsense. Now, some months ago, I talked about dentistry. I made the point that dentistry may not win a political party a general election, but it could just cost them one. And it seems to me this is a theme that is worth coming back to as we learn that 80% of the country find it literally impossible to get an NHS dentist. And if you go private, well, the bills can be absolutely enormous. Well, joining me is Neil Carmichael, Chair of the Association of Dental Groups and a former Conservative Member of Parliament, and John Northfield, a patient unable to get an NHS dentist for 2 years, who is now travelling 200 miles to get an NHS dentist. Neil, you're closely involved with the dental industry. I mean, in terms of the National Health Service providing dentistry, it seems to me it's virtually over.
Well, no, it's not, because what we've got to do instead is focus on the real cause of the problem, and that is definitely recruitment. Now, John is right. He lives in an area which we've identified as a dental desert.
Now, John, you're living in Devon.
Yeah, I am living there.
You're living in Devon,
North Devon, yeah.
And you've moved down to North Devon, and you've tried to get an NHS dentist
for 2 years. Yeah, I've lived there 2 years. Cannot get a dentist within a 30-mile radius of where we live, and I did have to travel back to Bromley some time ago for my wife. She had a bad problem with her tooth. Had to be cut out over in West Wickham. We went to a specialist place our dentist sent us to, and we are still. That was about a year ago. She went for special treatment over there. Was very pleased with the treatment she got in Bromley, but the dentist we was under there said he does feel that England seems to be going to like a third world society.
All right, it's a very strong point. So okay, you say clearly, Neil, that Devon is a dental desert.
It is. It's one of 40 approximately across the United States.
So where's not a dental desert?
Well, there are areas where you can't get a dentist. London's quite good for getting dentists. John sort of implied that by talking about Bromley. But there are too many areas, often coastal areas, often rural areas, which simply do not have enough dentists. And that affects the NHS provision, because at the end of the day...
Bear with me a second. Yeah. Bear with me a second. John, you've been a taxpayer.
Yep, all my life, yep.
And, you expect to have a GP. Even that's become more difficult to get a GP. I don't know what that's like in North Devon. Do you feel that having an NHS dentist is kind of a right that you've paid for?
It should be. I think the basic thing is if you don't see a dentist for over 2 years, it leads to other problems. People can get mouth cancers that don't get picked up. And I just cannot believe, to be honest, that in the last 13 years of the Conservative government, why it is now virtually impossible to get a dentist.
But you could go private, John.
As you have just stated to me, the problem with going private, it is a bottomless pit what the cost are. The reason I like going NHS, you have these 3 bands normally on NHS. You have a limit, you know what your expenditures are going to be. Whereas if you go private, I mean, it's just a bottomless pit what you can run into, isn't it, for the treatment.
So if I'm a patient, Neil, and I need a crown or whatever it is, and I simply can't get a local NHS dentist, I can go private. Doesn't it suit dentists just to be private rather than NHS? Isn't it easier for them? Isn't it simpler?
Well, I know lots and lots of dentists. I represent all the groups that are members of the association. They have associate dentists who work for them because, of course, a group, like most practices, effectively provides the facilities for dentists to operate in. The challenge is, where are the dentists? Because we need more dentists. If we were able to recruit just 1,000 more quickly, then we'd end up being able to provide 750,000 more appointments per year.
So 1,000 more dentists, 750,000 more appointments every year.
Yeah, put it another way, the government intends, or might be clawing back unspent money on NHS. That's about 400 million. That amounts to a massive amount of unused units of dental activity, and that's all within the NHS.
So why can't we get more dentists?
We can't get more dentists. First of all, we don't train them. We don't train enough. Now, the government quite rightly has said, oh yes, let's have a long-term plan about that, but the problem is long-term, because the net result of any expansion of dental schools will not really come through until 2030. And even if it does at that late time, that might just be replacing dentists who are retiring. So what we've got to do is see a way of getting more dentists into the system.
Is it retiring, Neil? Is it, and I get the point about retiring, and people at the right point are entitled to retire.
Correct, yeah.
Or is it, rather, as we see with doctors and surgeons and many others, that actually we train lots of people who then go and work abroad?
Well, that's not actually the case. What we need is more dentists here. We've got a lot of dentists.
But what I'm saying is, that, you know, right throughout the medical sector, we find with nurses, doctors, dentists and others that people go through the training schools in this country and then go and live in Australia.
Well, what I would say to that is, and funny enough, in Germany or France, there are more dentists than the United Kingdom per head of population. In fact, almost twice as many. So the argument that you know, we have enough dentists so they can go somewhere else just simply isn't stacking up. What we need to do is focus on the question of recruitment. And you asked, where are they going to come from? And clearly that's abroad. There are about, well, we don't really know the exact figure, but there's a large number of people who are trained as dentists and could practice as dentists if the General Dental Council, the GDC, responsible for the registering dentists in the United Kingdom, if they could get on with the job of facilitating their approval.
Will a Labour government help them? Well, I mean, Labour have come out with big plans for this.
Any government who wants to save the NHS and make sure the NHS can deliver what is planned to be delivered, and that's effectively £3 billion worth of UDAs, must help us get more dentists into this country. So, as I've said, 1,000 more alone would give
the number's impressive. John, you know, the polls tell us it's going to be a Labour government. Will they solve this?
Well, I personally don't think they will. All I would say, Nigel, I think it's a catastrophic situation the government have brought about. I mean, where I'm living at the moment, there's 500 new houses at this time being built. The people living in where I'm living now cannot get a dentist. And these 500 houses are going to be occupied shortly. I mean, the situation is just going from bad to worse, isn't it? No one's got any answers.
I think it is. And John, Neil, thank you. And folks, you see, whether we discuss housing, whether we discuss dentistry, we're back to the same problem. I know I'm getting boring talking about it. I'm alone in talking about it. We're living through a population explosion and we don't have the resources or the infrastructure to cope with it. I promise you.
We don't have the dentists to cope with it.
All the roads, all the schools, all the hospitals, or anything else. Net migration at 745,000. We cannot deal with any of this, in my view. In a moment, President Biden goes to his lowest poll rating ever, which backs up my prediction that the Dems will dump him. But he also gets rid of any prospect of a trade deal with the UK. Why is he doing that? All of that in 2 minutes.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
Wake up to the headlines with headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show.
Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else.
We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride.
Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
With every week that goes by, it becomes clearer that Joe Biden is completely unfit to be President of the United States and leader of the free world. I called him an old duffer from the day he was elected, but he gets worse and worse and becomes more and more embarrassing. And is it any wonder that his personal approval ratings as president are consistently sliding? They're now down to 34%. And however much the national mainstream media in America, Britain and the rest of the world say that 2024 is going to be a repeat of 2020 in that it's going to be Trump v. Biden, I'm sorry, I've now been saying for some months, I believe the Dems at some point will dump Biden. He is becoming too bigger embarrassment. He's down to 34%. And in some of the key swing states, Trump now has leads of 6, 7 and 8%. The Dems will realise under Biden, they're heading for disaster. That is my own personal view. Also, interestingly, any prospect of a framework being kept in place for a trade deal with the United Kingdom has now been dropped. Yes, I know that in agriculture and elsewhere, this was never going to be easy, but I've always had the feeling that Biden was pretty anti-British. Well, joining me from Palm Beach is Lee Cohen, Senior Fellow of the Bow Group. Lee, good evening or good afternoon to you, and thank you for joining us. These personal approval ratings for Biden, I mean, Trump at his very worst moment as president was down at around 41, 42% approval rating. This number of 34, in American terms, is a pretty historic low, isn't it?
Well, indeed. Let me just say, Nigel, what an honor it is to speak with you and to be on your show. So thank you for having me. Indeed, this is just unprecedented numbers like 34%, but I think well-deserved. And notwithstanding all efforts of the Biden administration to tout sort of non-existent accomplishments, the public are not fooled because we know what we're spending at the cash till.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And do you sort of understand why I'm saying and writing and commenting that the Dems will dump Biden? That it's all becoming too awkward. I mean, they've got their convention in July of next year. I mean, they can't stick with this man, can they?
Well, logic would say, how can they stick with a man with unprecedentedly low popularity ratings? But, you know, with every passing week and every passing day, it looks more difficult and head-scratching that how are they going to gracefully dump Biden? But I'm with you. I don't think when the day arrives that he'll be the nominee, but I don't yet know how we'll get there.
No, well, I guess the convention will be a very, very big moment in July for the Democrats in 2024. And who knows, maybe it's going to be the governor of California. Maybe he stays. I just can't see it. Now, Lee, what I've got you. Obviously, Brexit Britain able to make its own trade deals. The economic relationship between our two countries, huge. America is the biggest foreign investor in the United Kingdom. And still, the United Kingdom is the biggest foreign investor in the USA, which is amazing. And we share a language and, we'll sort of share a language. The spellings are a bit different, but we share films and music and culture and a history that's had a few ups and downs. We are incredibly culturally close as countries. I know we have some differences on agriculture and agricultural methods, but it would appear in the last 48 hours that Biden has literally killed all negotiations on a trade deal.
Indeed, Nigel. After 3 years of obstruction during the Biden administration, in October, it emerged that a modest US-UK trade partnership without commitments on market access would be discussed that could lead to a more robust bilateral deal. But now even that possibility looks remote due to antagonism within the Biden administration, the Democrat-controlled Senate.
Yeah, the Dems don't like the Brits very much, do they?
No, indeed, that is so. There's so much going on here. Democrats, as you say, see Britain as has been a colonial hangover responsible more for our American sins than for our triumphs, while Republicans, on the whole, are pro-British because they still prize the values inherited from Britain that enabled our own ascendance to greatness. Republicans know that our ideological fights against the forces that reject our history and value are the same existential struggles that you are engaged in across the pond.
You're right. You're right.
And for Biden, snubbing Britain is personal as well as political. So much of President Joe's identity is strongly steeped in outdated anti-British Irish grudge folklore. It's absolutely stunning that only he holds on to.
Well, Lee, I'm so pleased that you said that and not me. But I agree with it absolutely 100%. And yeah, I talk to Republicans and they talk Magna Carta. They talk about the great values. They talk about the Constitution of America, taking the best from us. And the Dems never do so. Lee Cohen, thank you very much indeed for joining me tonight on GB News. An absolute pleasure. But what the Farage moment today? You know, Rishi, the big speech. We're going to stop the boats. We are going to stop the boats. It's all going to be over. Oh, no. That's changed a bit now. It's now, there is no firm date to stop the boats, and we're told, what a victory. Only 30,000 young men have crossed the English Channel this year to move into 4-star hotel accommodation. Hooray! Only 30,000 young men have crossed. I tell you what, they're going absolutely nowhere with this. Now, I talked last night at great length about Michelle Mone, about the row that was going on. And I said absolutely clearly, yes, of course, she lied to the press. In the view of many, that's the same as lying to the country. But she's hit back pretty hard overnight at the Prime Minister, at other health ministers, saying, look, I told Michael Gove, I told the Cabinet Office very, very clearly that I was introducing a firm called PPE MedPro, in which my fiancé then and now husband, Doug Barrowman, was the major shareholder. And it would appear that on that she's right. My problem, which I raised last night, and which I'm going to say again, is up to £10 billion of taxpayers' money was spent on PPE that was never used. In the first few months of the pandemic, they ordered 5 years' worth of PPE, when most of it has to be scrapped after 18 months. It isn't just Michelle Mone and Doug Barrowman that made profits out of PPE procurement. There are hundreds of people who made money and dozens of people who made huge numbers of millions. I would estimate that something like £4 to £4.5 billion of private sector profit was made out of PPE, most of it not ever used. But here's the point I want to repeat from last night. The COVID inquiry will not even discuss PPE procurement, who was in charge, why these decisions were made, until the spring of 2025. And I'm going to say it now for the first time. Nobody else has said it. I believe the COVID inquiry must discuss procurement, must get Michelle Mone, must get Michael Gove, must get everybody involved to be held publicly to account. We cannot have a general election that takes place before we understand why these huge sums of money were wasted. Still today in the modern world, about 97% of international trade takes place by sea, in increasingly large containers. And the Red Sea is one of those very, very important routes. But the Iran-funded Houthi rebels are increasingly launching rocket attacks, air attacks against shipping. We're now being told by oil companies that rather using the Red Sea, they may go round the whole of the coast of Africa. The oil price yesterday spiked by $3 a barrel on the back of this. Are we heading for a global shipping crisis? And if we do, could this be the next rout of inflation that hits our country?
On Patrick Christie's tonight, 9 till 11 p.m, I've got a cracking show for you. After the alleged anti-white racism storm, BBC 5 Live presenter Nihal Arthur-Naika has snapped back, saying that he will never stay quiet. But should he just shut up? Plus, Dame Esther Ransom has signed up for Dignitas, but does she actually have her family support? Dame Esther's daughter will join me live. I'll also speak exclusively to the bloke flogging Churchill's barge. And we've got the liveliest pay-per-view anywhere on telly. Patrick Christie's tonight, 9 till 11 p.m. Be there.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other pay-per-review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle. Could you be quiet? What is this?
It's my new teeth.
It's your new teeth. I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
every Sunday from 11. Join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
As Iran flexes their muscles, and they back, of course, Hamas, they back Hezbollah, but they also back the Yemeni Houthi rebels, who are increasingly posing a genuine threat to shipping in the Red Sea. Aerial attacks, risk, of course, of being taken hostage. And now, insurance premiums for moving ships through the Red Sea have gone through the roof at Lloyd's of London, and big oil firms are now redirecting oil that is coming from the Gulf states, perhaps around the whole of Africa, meaning some certain deliveries won't be met. The oil price, I mean, it's funny, isn't it? At the weekend, petrol and diesel was the lowest it had been for 2 years. Oil back down at $75 a barrel. But as soon as this news breaks, it starts to spike. 97% of global trade takes place by sea. The Red Sea now is clearly a very major problem. But I suspect that's not the only global shipping disaster we could potentially face. I'm joined now by Professor Andrew Tettenborn, member of the Institute of International Shipping and Trade Law at Swansea University's School of Law. Andrew, thank you very much indeed for joining me tonight on the programme. Let's just begin, if we can, please. Thank you. Good to see you. Let's begin with the Red Sea. How important is it as a global shipping route?
I think you have to distinguish between different kinds of cargo here. The oil price has spiked, but I think that may be fairly temporary. The point is, you can't get a very large crude carrier through the Red Sea. The biggest ship you can get through, I think, is about 200,000 tons deadweight. Most of the the VLCCs and the ULCCs go round the Cape anyway. So obviously this is going to divert some oil cargoes. I think roughly 10 shiploads tend to pass a day through the canal, but that's likely to be solved. I think the real problem is going to be containerized goods, and I'm afraid to say the goods that you might have been expecting to get for Christmas, because they do go through the Suez Canal. It's going to cost big money to divert them, and there's going to be a shortage of them for some time. What you're also going to find is difficulties with our own industry, because a lot of it runs on the basis of just-in-time supply, and of course the supply won't arrive just in time. It'll arrive rather late, which means we'll have a number of instances, I suspect, where the production will be stopped and you won't be able to get things. And we'll also, of course, have an element of inflation because it costs more to ship round the Cape.
Yeah, no, I mean, clearly there are inflationary implications to all of this. You talk about containerization. As somebody that crosses the English Channel in small fishing boats, I've noticed over the years the container ships get bigger and bigger and bigger. How many containers do the largest ships now take?
Oh, Lord, I think it's a five-figure sum. I think it's about 30,000. It keeps on getting bigger every time I look at it. But the bigger Maersk ships, we're talking that sort of figure. But most container ships can get through the Suez Canal, not all. And it's those that are going to face the problems, because Maersk has already said, Maersk being one of the biggest shipping lines in the world, Maersk has already said none of its ships now is going up the Red Sea. In practice, they'll either be diverted to other ports or they'll be sent round the Cape. That's why we're going to see serious problems in respect of these containerized cargoes, which unfortunately comprise most of the stuff that you buy that comes from the Far East.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as for your comment about the just-in-time supply chains, I was told that if we voted Brexit, that would be the biggest problem, but clearly there are other global problems too. Other than the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, and, you know, it's 70 years ago, but we kind of went to war over the Suez Canal back in those days. Are there other problems around this very unstable world at the moment with shipping, insurance premium and risk?
Well, the one thing which is coming up again now is piracy off the Somali coast. Now, we thought that we had solved that. It was a trouble for a long time until shipping lines started putting armed guards on board ships, which caused problems with one or two people. But that actually was fairly effective at stopping it. But there may now be a rise in piracy again there. You also have to remember that there are other areas where piracy can be a problem, notably off the Gulf of Guinea. That's off the coast of West Africa. It's less of a problem in terms of the number of ships seized, but it's more of a problem in that the pirates there tend to be much nastier and much more cruel to the people they take.
And what does all this mean, Andrew, for the insurance industry? I mean, Lloyd's of London, obviously famously the great global centre for shipping insurance. You know, what is the impact on premiums and how does that knock on to the everyday consumer?
Oh, the impact on premiums is going to be to send it up. War premiums in particular tend to be very considerably higher, or war supplements tend to be very considerably higher than what you'd normally expect to pay. And cargo insurance and hull insurance are a major part of transport costs. And what's happened is that insurers at Lloyd's have now said we are going to regard many more areas as war areas where you're going to have to pay a massively increased premium. You've also got to remember something else. It's not only insurance. If you charter a ship, there may very well be limits on your ability to take it into a war zone. The charter may contain provisions saying you can't do it. That, again, of course, is going to put up transport costs.
Yep, and if transport costs go up and prices go up, guess who pays? Ultimately, viewers and listeners to this show. Andrew Tettenborn, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Not at all. As I said, folks, 1956, over Suez, it was considered to be so important that the Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, decided we ought to go to war over the issue. It led to his downfall, a major rift with America. Don't underestimate the importance of shipping. Now, coming up next, of course, is State of the Nation with Jacob Rees-Mogg, and I've dragged him in early because we need to have a proper chat. Now, Jacob, it's been very interesting the last 48 hours. There is this pantomime villain, entirely correct for this time of the year, as is the season. Michelle Mone is the great devil. You know, she lied to the press about her involvement. Her husband's company made 60 million quid profit. But I am very, very struck here that we ordered 5 years' worth of PPE between February and July 2020. And up to £10 billion of that was never used. And I just wonder, is it possible that Michelle Mone's being used as a scapegoat by a government that would rather not discuss the truth?
Well, the truth is that everyone in the world wanted PPE and wanted as much of it as possible.
Yep.
And it turned out to be unnecessary. That's what really happened. And I think the defence of the government is that at the beginning of COVID, people didn't know how the disease worked, how it was spread, and it was thought that PPE was essential. And you had all those stories about how nursing homes couldn't get hold of PPE, how they needed it urgently, and therefore every avenue was followed to try and find PPE.
And so we overordered.
We overordered and we overpaid. The price went shooting up. We've just been talking about shipping and how that's had an effect on the price of oil. When there is a risk to supply, the price goes up. And the price of PPE absolutely shot up. So there are people who made a ton of money on this.
And not just Michelle Mone.
Oh, not just Michelle Mone. Lots of people, particularly the Chinese producers of PPE. But bear in mind what was going on, that the Germans banned the export of PPE to Italy. You know, in the fabled EU single market, they put an export restriction on because PPE was thought to be so valuable and so essential in fighting COVID, and people wanted to make sure there was plenty of it. How we ordered 5 years,
I want to get to
I don't know.
Jacob, I've got one quick thing to say. The COVID inquiry will not be discussing PPE procurement until the spring of 2025. Don't we deserve, ahead of a general election, to have this out in the open, to get Michelle Mone, Michael Gove and everybody else before us in effectively a public court?
Well, of course we do. The COVID inquiry seems obsessed by saying we should all have been locked up for longer and harder and not concentrating on anything that's actually of interest to people.
I agree. Well, this is my little bugbear.
Yeah,
Jacob, briefly, what can we expect tonight?
We're going to be talking about euthanasia, assisted dying, assisted suicide, whatever you want to call it, brought to the fore by Esther Rantzen.
Yes.
Is it something we should have? Personally, I think not, but we'll be going through the case both
Jacob,
against and for.
I cannot think of an issue that I had to face in 20 years as an MEP that I felt more confused over than this particular one.
We'll have to listen.
Very different. I'll be in the car listening. That's enough from me. Let's have a look at the weather. Back with you tomorrow at 7 o'clock.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello, welcome to your latest GB News weather update from the Met Office. Rain will continue to clear through this evening, bringing many of us clearer skies overnight tonight. That's because we've seen a cold front sweep southeastwards across the country. That's clearing off tonight, and behind it we see this brisk northwesterly wind direction developing for the rest of the week. That will bring a swathe of showers to parts of Northern Ireland, much of Scotland and into Northern England and North Wales by the end of the night. These could fall as snow over the hills of Scotland for a time. Further east, though, it will stay dry and clear for much of the night, and that will allow temperatures to fall away. It will be a colder night than last night here, with a risk of grass frost by tomorrow morning. And across eastern areas, the morning will be much brighter than this morning tomorrow. However, the cloud will thicken towards lunchtime as a warm front arrives from the northwest. That will introduce quite a lot of persistent drizzly rain to western areas as well as hills, and some quite dull cloud. Temperatures will rise as a result, though, so it will be a milder afternoon tomorrow afternoon. However, the winds will strengthen as well, so it will turn quite windy.